Welcome to Chapter 2, Session 2. In this session, we're going to be working more with some selectors and different ways that you can keep track of your elements in your CSS. Let's get started. The first part of CSS selectors is recognizing how the selector patterns work. So in the previous section, we just did an H1. So that's how you used to be able to do it. You could do a single selector, a single element type, and it worked just fine. But there's a lot of things that we can do now, especially in HTML5 or in CSS3, that is going to allow us to add some more details to our selectors. So first, we're going to talk about contextual selectors. These are going to be selectors that are specific to the context. Now you can have, first off, you can have a wildcard selector. You can have a star, which is a wildcard. You can have an individual element like the H1 that we've already talked about. You can also have multiple elements. So any of the elements that are selected with a comma in between them. So an H1, comma, H2. We've done those three. The next we want to talk about is parents and descendants. So a lot of times you're going to have a section that has a parent element, and then inside of that parent element, you'll have multiple children or descendants of that parent. And I want those to be affected. So we start talking about how the relationship works between the parent and the descendant, and we can only apply this style rule to descendants of this given parent. So in the parent descendant, in the example here, we have a header and an H1. If I have an H1 inside of my header, I want it to be red. But if I have an H1 anywhere else in my code, I don't want that affected. So I only want this to apply to descendants of the parent that I've specified, or H1s that are inside of my header. So that's a parent descendant. There's just a space between the two. So you say the parent, space, and descendant, and that allows you to do descendants of a given parent. The next we have is similar to that. It matches children elements as a child of a parent. So this is similar to just a descendant, but it's just a little bit different. So in this case, a parent has a child element in it, specifically a child element directly underneath the parent. The parent descendant means any of the descendants. So it could be down 3 levels. It could be 1, 2, 3, inside of a paragraph, inside of something else. But if you want it to be a direct child of the parent, that you need to use a little greater than sign. So instead of doing a space between the two, you put a greater than sign. So parent greater than child is going to affect only that type that is a direct child of the parent, as opposed to grandchildren, so on further down the tree. In that case, you would just do the parent greater than child, and you can always use that wildcard character in there if you want to, all of the children of a given type. The element plus element talks about siblings. So siblings are 2 children that are next to each other of the same parent, next to each other being siblings. So any of the siblings or any of the children that are of a given parent. The element with a plus symbol is where the element 2 is immediately preceded by the sibling. In other words, it's the sibling next or that was previous to him in line. So if you had 1, 2, 3, and 4, using the plus symbol on number 3 would only give you 2. So the one that was just previous to it. The tilde does the other direction. It's the sibling that follows the element that is being chosen. So if I said element 2 was the child, element 1 in this case would be the sibling that was just after. And you can see with the little example chart that we have here, all of these are little different ones to show you which sibling are we going to talk about, the ones after, the ones before. So immediately preceded or ones that follow. Remember that hierarchy of parents and children and siblings, because it's going to help you to understand which symbology you're going to use in your contextual selectors. Wildcards can be used anywhere. So you can use a wildcard to say, I want to give everybody at whatever position you're going to be using. And the styles are always passed to the children. So remember, if I put a style in, the children of that style are also going to be affected unless explicitly defined another way. So if we explicitly say regular p tags are not going to be affected, then you're fine. But if you haven't added that in before, then they're going to inherit from their parent. That's how the cascading part works. You always inherit from your parents unless explicitly defined another way. At this point, we're going to go ahead and create some style rules with contextual selectors. So the last time we had gone through in our styles, we had done our HTML, our body, and then our headings. But this time we're going to add some that are more related to the elements and using those contextual selectors. So in this case, we are going to add in something for the asides block quotes. So these comments hanging out over here, those are going to be our block quotes, and we want to make those a certain color. So what we're going to do is we're going to say aside block quote, and what that's going to do is it's going to say if you're a block quote inside of an aside, then change your colors. If you're a block quote somewhere randomly, it won't affect you. It's going to start with an the yellow underneath because there's no actual entries in there. As soon as I start adding the entries for the attributes, it'll go ahead and update that. So we are going to use 232, 165, and 116, which should look kind of familiar because it's similar to that salmon color that we've been kind of playing with around. So I'm going to go ahead and save and refresh, and you're going to see what it did was it changed the color. Color is the text color. That's what we wanted to do in this case, was to change the text color. In the previous section, we talked about how we did selectors based on the element type and where it is in context to the entire site. Now we're going to start talking about how to reference individual specific elements. In this case, you can use an ID field or a class. So if you have applied an ID field, you would say an attribute is an ID equal to whatever your ID is. So you can apply an ID field. If you want to use a class, you would say class is equal to, and then whatever string you want to use for your class name. When you reference the ID field, you're going to be using a hashtag. So it's going to be either a hashtag ID or it's going to be an element type, a P or a div or a header or a nav, a UL, LI, hashtag, and then the ID field that you have selected. So we can reference those two selector patterns with ID fields. With classes, it's going to be a period. So if I used a class, I can do period class, so I can do period my class name, or I can again use an element dot class. So I could do a P dot my class name to reference those. And so the selectors for attributes, those are the four that you're going to use a lot. The next one down is the element that has a given attribute. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read them on your own time, and of course, they're in the book. But the element with an attribute is referencing, does the attribute exist? The element with the attribute equals a given value is saying the element not only has this attribute, but the attribute is always equal to this value. So we can specifically say, we want to do, LIs that have a value of blank or something like that. And we want those to be referenced in here. So we want to know which attribute do you want to apply it to and what is the value therein. There are a couple of little extra ones. The contains word starts with, ends with, and contains that you can also do. And those work fine. You just have to use the special symbol and the equal sign. And we'll do a couple of those in this class as well. Okay, so at this time, we're going to go ahead and update the headings of the articles to change those directly. And we're going to change those from being just basic H1s and H2s to being ones that are related only to the sections that are in an article and the sections that are called about TSS. So let's see how that looks. Article, and then we use a hashtag because we want to just do the about TSS ID field, and then the H1s that are under that. So what this is going to do is make sure that when we change our H1 and H2 on our about page, our other pages will not get affected for those. So this should look similar, but these that are not inside that about TSS section are not going to change. So if we go back to our home, you will see links, or the navigation does not have an ID, but the article here, it does. So this is the article ID for this section right in here. That's the section that we wanted the H1 and H2 to affect. We didn't want it to affect this comments here or this links over here. So that was how we could specify just update the H1 and H2 for just that section. So the next thing that we're going to do is update our other 3 pages here. We have our home, we have running, cycling, and swimming. And those 3 pages are not updated yet because they still have the underscore text. So we're going to go into each of those 3 pages and we're going to make sure that they look right and with the right headings. And then we're going to add in some CSS for those pages. So our bikes page here does not have the link to the style sheet yet. So we're going to have to update that. So let's just rename our bike text here. And then we're going to go ahead and include both the layout and the styles. Now, over here in our main or our home page, we've already done it. So in this case, I can just copy and paste. So I can copy and then come down and paste. Okay, so now we have those pages in place. We should be able to come over here and click running, and that should go to the running page. We should be able to click cycling, goes to the cycling page, and swimming goes to the swimming page. Again, remember the salmon color is still there, so we can flip between those. So they've already done all the work for setting up the HTML and or the hyperlinks for those pages. So now we're going to be affecting the article syllabus section. Now we're going to go look at our bike, run, and swim, and you'll notice that in our biking page, let's go to cycling, we have our nav bar, and then we have a class here called syllabus. So that's what we're going to be referencing. If you go to the run page, you will see that that middle section also has a section called syllabus, and our swim page also has a section called syllabus. So we're going to affect all 3 of those all at the same time. You'll notice that our main page does not, because it has the About TSS instead of a syllabus. So we are going to come over to our heading styles, and we are going to say article dot syllabus. And that means it's going to reference any article section that has a class of syllabus. H1, comma, and then we're going to do article syllabus H2, because we're going to want both headings H1 and H2 to both be the same reference. We're going to do a background color of a RGB with 255, 185, and 255, which is kind of a yellowish. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's pink. And then we're going to do our color, and it's also going to be an RGB, but in this case, it's just going to be 101, 101, 101, which I believe is a gray. Yeah. Okay. So if we go to our homepage still looks the same. We go to our running page, and you will see that this pink is now our heading for our running, our cycling, and our swimming, because we have added it to both H1s and H2s that exist within that syllabus class inside of an article. So here we have an article with a syllabus class. So any H1s inside there and any H2s inside there are going to automatically be made into that pink. So now we're going to talk about fonts. Fonts are fun. So you can change around your fonts for any of the items that or any of the elements that are in your HTML page. The name that we use for the attribute type is a font family, and we purposely use the word family because the font isn't always just an individual font by itself. Sometimes there's other items that go along with it. So we like to refer to font families. In this case, a lot of things are, Arial, Times New Roman. You've heard these. Consolas, Calibri, Verdana. These are different fonts that you can put in at any point as a font family in your elements, in your CSS. Generic fonts have 5 options, which just describe the font without using a specified name. So the 5 that we're going to talk about are serif, which is a typeface that has a little ornamentation at the end. It's got a little bit of a tail. Sans serif, sans meaning without the ornamentation, is a typeface without the ornamentation. Monospace, where each of the different characters are an a specified space away from each other, kind of looks like terminal, where all the letters use up the same amount of space. Cursive, which is kind of a handwriting, kind of a prettier, something like that. And then fantasy, which is a really fun one, very ornamental. You usually use it just sparingly in like maybe the first letter of a word in a special situation, like the start of a book or something like that. So these are the basic generic fonts, and you can always set your font to one of the generic fonts. But if you have a specified font that you want to use, you can use that. However, it is very important to try to use font stacks. And the reason we use font stacks is if the browser can't find the font you're looking for, it can go to the next one in your stack. So the stacks that I've listed here, we have like an Arial stack that does an Arial, and then it does a Helvetica, and then it does a sans serif. So if it can find Arial, cool, it's lovely, it makes it an Arial. If it can't find Arial for whatever reason, it goes and finds Helvetica. If it can't find Helvetica, then it goes on to just a sans serif, which will be in any browser. So we like to use these stacks to make sure, again, that any browser, anybody looking at your website, is going to be able to use some sort of a font that's going to look somewhat close to what you want it to look like. So using these font stacks, it will always load the first one first and then go down until it finds one that works. General rules with fonts. When people really start getting into new design, they go, oh, well, cool. Since I can do all these cool fonts, I'm going to do 5 different fonts, 10 fonts all through my page. Every other letter is a different font. It's going to be really cool. It isn't. It looks terrible. Please don't do that. So general rule is try not to use too many fonts. You might want to have a font for your header and a font for your body, and that's about it. They sometimes are the same font. Maybe a couple of little specialty fonts in there at certain points, but in general, try to refrain from using too many fonts. Sans serif, the one without the ornamentation, is going to be for your header and your body, because you don't really want that specialty little, cursive line for most of your header and body. That's just going to get confusing. You can use those for things like special effects or larger text, thing that is already bold and standing out, so we can use something kind of fun. If you would like to use your own personal web font, there are a lot of web fonts that are available on the internet that you can use for some of your projects. So you're going to be able to do the importing of that file. And as you'll see, we've done a web font in this tutorial to show you how it's done. But what we're going to do, there are a couple of different web font styles. The TTF is a true type. That's a pretty common one. SVG is the vector graphics, and the WOFF is the web open font format. All of these are going to be different depending on where you're getting your web fonts or if you're building them yourself. When you do that, you're going to use the @ rule with the word font face at the top of your page to import that font first. So you're going to tell the CSS at the very top, I'm importing a font face here, so let's get that. Then when you get down to using the font, you just reference it by whatever font family name you've given it in your font face declaration. So now we're going to do a font family. And as we talked about, font families are going to be describing which font name we're going to be using. In this case, we're going to be adding it to the body because we want the fonts all to be the same similar font throughout the entire system. It doesn't look very good to have fonts changing as you go along unless it's really intentional. So we're going to go ahead and put this inside of our body right underneath our background color of ivory that we've already done. We're going to do font family. And when I click my tab button to go into it, you can see that there's a couple of web stacks already created for me. The one that the book would like you to do is the Verdana Geneva sans serif. If that doesn't exist, which I don't believe it does exactly, you can find one that's similar, or you can just type them out. In this case, I'm just going to do Verdana Geneva and just delete that Tahoma. You can just type them. They know the names as you type them. You can see how, if I just typed Verd, and it would start looking for it. And what that's going to do is make sure that all of our pages all have the same font, this Verdana. So now with my dev tools here, I can look at my computed style, and it'll tell me that my rendered file is going to be Verdana because this browser has it. That was the first one that it could find. If I wanted to test on a different browser, I could do that and see if it still uses that same rendered font. So in this page, we're going to be using a web font. We're going to be adding a specific web font to our pages. So we're going to go back to our styles page here. And directly after the character set up here, remember we talked about our @ rules. We're going to tell them that we want to use a font face. And that means that it's going to go get the font that we want. In this case, you can see that there are two different fonts that have been included, a TTF and a WOFF. So both of those fonts have been included in your file. So we're going to practice with those. So we are going to do an @ symbol. We're going to say font face. We are going to say font family because we need to give a name for the family so that we can reference it in other places. So we're going to call this Quicksand. And then we're going to tell it where to go get those fonts from. In this case, we're going to go to a URL and we're going to do Quicksand regular TFF, and that is a format of true type. Oops. And we're going to put a comma because we're going to be importing two of these, a URL of Quicksand and we're going to use the regular wolf. I've got my comma in the wrong place. There we go. And its format of a WOFF. And then we're going to add a semicolon at the end. Oh, that's where it is. Okay, so our two different font faces are going to be installed now. We have both of those, but we haven't told anybody to use them yet. So at the top of our heading styles, we have our article, our About TSS, and our regular syllabus, but we want to do something just for our H1 and H2. Just those two all together and tell them that we want them to use the Quicksand that we just installed. So we're going to say font family, and we're going to say Quicksand, comma, and then we're going to go ahead and add the Verdana, Geneva, and Sans Serif. And this is going to allow us to make those headers look a little different. This is the different font. You could see that it just changed a little bit. It's a little thinner. And they have all updated to use that font. The important thing is to be able to use that same font throughout your system so that everything looks consistent. Now we're going to talk about the font size. So font sizes are kind of fun. You can have your font size as either an absolute size of points, but that's usually only used in print media because as websites modify and change, as the screen size changes and everything's all relative, we don't really want to use a point. So when you're writing something to be printed, you might want to set it as a 12 point or something like that. But for general websites, you don't want to use absolute units. You want to use relative units. So in relative units, we generally refer to them as pixels. So for each individual pixel, as we've talked about pixels before, those are the size of the pixel relative to the other objects because it's all based on your resolution of your page. So we do a lot of things in pixels. However, pixels started to get really confusing as CSS modified because so many different things were either a tiny little cell phone, your smartphone, up to a big, 28-inch monitor. Did we really want to do pixels? Or did we want to do something that was kind of relative to a default size? So we created something called an EM, which is a unit where 100% is equal to a default font size. We can set our default font size to be some certain size, and then everything that's EM'd is going to be relative to that. So we can do a 2 EM, which is twice the normal size, or we can do 1.5, which is 150%. We can do 0.8, which is 80% of the basic size, so on and so forth. We have also brought in a root M element, which is going to be relative to the HTML element size throughout, as opposed to just whatever your base font size is that's given. So you can do that so that if you have defined your HTML font size, everything can be relative to that using the root EM, or you can use just the basic EM, which is going to be the default font size for your browser. We also have a way of describing font sizes as a percentage of the browser window. Now, depending again on the size of your screen, what type of monitor you're using, that viewport, which is the size of your monitor, the actual viewing size, can be modified by a lot of different things. It could be bigger or smaller based on how you stretched out, increase, decrease the size of your browser. So a viewpoint unit is 1% of the browser's width, and we have a viewpoint height, VH, which is 1% of the browser's height. And we can use those pieces of information to refer to entering in a font size that is related to those. We can also use the specialty keywords. So XX small, X small, small, medium, large, XL, double XL. So we can also say that, which is going to increase or decrease as expected from, again, the default font size without having to worry about, is it 1.5, is it 2, is it whatever. They're just going to use their basic valuation. So these are the different font sizes that you can use. At this point, we're going to go ahead and change our font sizes for our H1 and H2. We want to go ahead and set those to specific numbers rather than just using the default. So I'm going to go ahead and do H1, and I'm going to say font size, and we're going to use that EM. We're going to do 2.2 EM so that it's relative to the sizes of the page. And for our H2, we are going to use 1.5 EM. And that's just going to change around the font sizes a little bit. So H1 is going to be a little bigger and H2, but you can see that those sizes are going to be consistent across all of our pages. Just in case, whether they're in an aside or whether they're in an article or whether they're in someplace else. We're also going to go down to the aside and block quotes and set those font sizes as well. So with our aside, we want to do our font size, and we want to set that to 0.8 EM, so just a little smaller than normal. And our navigation, we want our nav bar to have a font size also of 0.8 EM. Now I could have done both of those together and done aside comma nav, but I kind of like to keep them separate just to make sure that I know which one I'm changing. And you can see now they're a little smaller. So our block quotes are smaller because that's inside of an aside, and our nav bar are a little smaller because we've updated those font sizes. Actually, we should probably put our nav down inside of our nav list so we keep our separates. You'll notice in HTML that they have them commented out so that you know which side is which. When you go back to figure out which element you want to update, it's always good to have that. When we're looking at the spacing and the indentation between items, sometimes, as you know, if you're writing a document in Word or something like that, you want to double space it because it makes things cleaner and easier to see. You want to do a hanging indent, so you want to do that indent in by 0.5 inches in a document before the rest of the paragraph, just to make it obvious this is the beginning of the paragraph. So these are things that we can use to control our spacing and our indentation in our website. First, we're going to look at the word tracking. Tracking is going to be the space between individual words, word spacing. So you can specify the tracking size to be able to tell the difference between words. Kerning is the space between the characters. So this is where your monospace versus an Arial are going to be different spaces between the letters, or how much space do you want each character to hold. So it's character letter spacing, each individual character. The leading space is the space between the lines of text, and it's called line height. So we use the line height attribute in CSS to determine what we call leading, which is simply the space between the text. If you wanted to make it double spaced, set your leading to 2, and it'll suddenly be double spaced. The other thing is a hanging indent, just like we do in Word, where the indentation of the first line is set to a certain amount. Every line thereafter in a paragraph or whatever is going to be different, or it's going to be back to the beginning of your regular space. So hanging indent, tracking is between words, kerning is between characters, leading is that space between lines, so line height. Okay, so now we're going to set the letter spacing and the line heights now that we have updated those, or now that we've talked about those. So in our heading section, in the H1, H2, so we have an H1 and an H2 separately. This one's going to be one that's consistent for both of those. So we're going to put it in this section and we're going to call it letter spacing. And in this case, we are going to set it to 0.1 EM. And that's going to set that letter spacing for our headers a little bit wider so that they don't look smushed together. You saw how some of that text looked a little bit smushed together. It just stretches out the letter spacing just a little bit. And down in our nav section, we are going to make a nav and then specifically our UL elements inside of our nav bar. And we are going to set our line height for those to be 2 EM. And this is going to allow us to separate out these here so that they look a little bit further apart. See how that does that? So all of those, if you go to each page, they're all updated with the new line heights. In the last part of this session, we're going to be talking about different font styles. Now, with font styles, you can play around with your fonts and make your things completely unique. Again, don't go overboard because in this case, more is not always best. So we can change our font style, which is going to be italic, oblique, or normal. And I'm giving you the examples there of which ones are those. Your font weight that's the bold. So if you want to set your font weight for an entire element rather than just using an inline, strong, or bold. Text decoration is your overline and underline and line through, so strikeout. By the way, you can always use underline and overline together, which are kind of fun because then you get a line at the top and line at the bottom of the text. Looks like it's kind of got a square around it, but doesn't. You can do text transform, which is going to be making it uppercase, lowercase, or capitalizing everything. The variant is going to be your small caps. Text align is your horizontal alignment, not your vertical alignment, because vertical align is different. Vertical align gives you a couple of different options. The normal ones are top, middle, and bottom, but there's a couple of baselines and supers and subscripts in there as well. You can have all of these in one line if you want to. You can have them all on separate lines as well. It depends on how you want to do it. But if you have a font that you want, like the example given here, it's an italicized, small caps, bold. It's got a font size of 1.5 and a line height of 2 EM, so it's double spaced. It uses the font family of Arial and then sans serif if Arial doesn't exist, all in one line. Some people really like to condense that and make it all one line because that just makes it all clean and in one place rather than using 6 lines to cover all of these different ones. So that gives you some examples of font styles. The last tutorial for this section is going to be on the font properties. So we've talked about the different ways that you can make your fonts look a certain way. So in this section, we are going to be updating the footer. So the footer of our entire page is kind of boring. First off, it's down here at the bottom and it doesn't really look very good. So we're going to play around with our footer. So inside of our body element, inside the footer, footer, and using the address section. So all we're going to be updating now is the section that's the address. So the body, footer, address. And we're going to do a background color of RGB 222.128.60. We are going to set our regular color to be white so that it contrasts nicely. We are going to set our color again to RGBA just in case something has a problem with this and it doesn't look beautiful. This is what we would prefer. but we went ahead and did white just in case the RGBA wasn't something that our browser could read, because even the older browsers are still going to understand that. So our color is actually kind of a little grayish. We are going to say our font is going to be either the normal font, or it's going to be the normal font with small caps, with bold, with a 0.09 EM and 3 EM, with the Quicksand, Verdana, Geneva, and sans serif. Oops. It's my home. So that's going to set all of our nice fonts, and then we're going to do our text align here and make it centered. So if I look back over on my home before I refresh this, we are going to look at our footer. And in this case, the entire footer is enclosed in an address tag. So the whole thing will refresh now. And you can see, changed the font to the Quicksand that we wanted. It did the background. It did the font colors. It centered it. It did small caps all at the same time. And added in some margins. So, or the line heights and the font size. So that is how we could set all of our footer all in one line for our font. And then of course, updating the colors, the background color, and making it centered. So this is the end of session 2 for chapter 2. We will move on to session 3 in the next video.